and Labour have clear differences in their policies on how we should trade after Brexit, with Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, saying we should have a customs union with the EU, compared to Theresa May, who says we shouldn't. But what does all this mean for consumers? Well, Emma Vardy's been looking at how Brexit could affect our shopping bills.
The way we change our relationship with the EU in future could affect us all here on the High Street. The Conservatives and Labour have two distinct visions of the type of Brexit they want. And prices could go up or down, depending on the type of Brexit that we get.
Both Conservatives and Labour want to have free trade with the EU after Brexit. But the Conservatives want to leave the customs union and the single market.
Think of the EU single market and customs union like a great big high street where we can buy and sell stuff from EU countries at no extra cost.
At the moment, goods are traded between EU countries free of charge. Jeremy Corbyn says we should stay in a customs union with the EU, with the aim of keeping prices on our shopping pretty much the same. But at the moment, if we want goods imported from outside the EU, then they are charged and we have to pay extra tariffs. Theresa May says we're going to leave the European single market and the customs union so that we're less constrained by EU trade rules, and so that we would be free to strike our own trade deals with other countries.
The economists who are enthusiastic about Brexit think that we can make big savings by cutting tariffs on goods that currently we have high tariff levels, like textiles and clothing, for example. Most economists point to the fact that there aren't actually all that many goods where there are high tariffs on imports from the rest of the world, and most economists think that having a bit more friction on half of our trade, which comes from the EU, is going to be much more costly than the benefits that we'd get from cutting tariffs on the rest of the world.
There's no perfect way of forecasting what will happen in any Brexit scenario. Take dairy, for example. Around a quarter of all our dairy products are imported from the EU. If we leave the customs union, the price could go up. But imports from the rest of the world, like butter from New Zealand, could become cheaper. Likewise, our meat from the EU could become a bit more expensive. But we could benefit from cheaper imports from the rest of the world.
But experts don't always agree when it comes to how much prices may change. And you may well hear some politicians saying completely the opposite from one another when it comes to how us consumers may be affected. And that's because prices could change by a greater or lesser degree, depending on how the logistical challenges of leaving the EU play out.
Some of the effects of leaving the customs union are fairly easy and direct to predict. If we cut tariffs on textiles and clothing, then we can work out how much textiles and clothing we buy from the rest of the world, what the price reductions will be. On other aspects, it's harder to make estimates. We know that there will be increased friction on trade with the EU, but it's harder to put a definite number on how big these frictions will be.
With clothing, a lot of it's imported from non-EU countries where tariffs are high, so it could become cheaper after Brexit. But contrast that with things like cosmetics and soaps. We buy a lot of this from the EU and it's heavily regulated, so leaving the customs union could mean cosmetics get more expensive.
But don't forget, shopping for goods is only one part of what we spend our money on. Leaving the customs union and single market could also affect things like package holidays, airfares and services like banking. But predicting that is much harder until we know what sort of Brexit we end up with.
Emma Vardy there. Well, watching that was Warwick Lightfoot from the Policy Exchange think tank, who served as a special advisor to a number of Conservative chancellors. Now, everyone's interested in the price of things, Warwick, and you could say that since we had that referendum, before we've even left the EU, things have got more expensive.
Yes, because the exchange rate went down. But what is interesting about that is that because we've got a period when international commodity prices have been pretty weak, they're down about a third compared with 5 years ago. They haven't gone up very much over the last 18 months. because we've got much more intense competition in the retail sector, the so-called pass-through from the lower exchange rate into higher prices has been much weaker than one might have expected. So if you think back to about 2010, 11, 12, when commodity prices went up, the exchange rate had gone down, there's quite a strong pass-through into shopping baskets. It's been rather more mute this time.
But can you understand why consumers might be thinking, yikes, inflation is going up, it hasn't seemed to have tailed off, imports are more expensive, and so is my shopping?
Actually not. I think what I find interesting, because remember, I'm old enough to have seen the inflation in the 1970s and in the 1980s.
Sure.
What I'm impressed by is actually the commitment the public and the press and the political community have to steady low inflation of around 2%. And how sticky prices have been, which I think is generally a good thing, because if we can get back to a world where you're quite confident that you're not going to actually risk a sharp takeoff in inflation, that is a good thing. That's got nothing to do, I might add, with the EU in or out of your single market or customs union. We do have some very interesting things to talk about the customs union, farm prices and textiles, which is a separate matter.
Right. Who's right in terms of the political parties on whether we should be in a customs union or not?
So it's complicated. I don't know about who's right, but for me, I think you've got to go back to why many people voted to leave the European Union, which was essentially because they were frustrated with the state of the economy. They were frustrated and fed up with their living standards being squeezed. Things like the housing crisis, worried about the prospects for their children. So I think when you come to these, and they are very techie, complex issues, like the customs union, your test has to be, will it make it easier or will it make it harder to address some of these issues? Will it make it easier to create jobs? Will it make it easier to deal with living standards? And if it doesn't, then why would you do it? So if you take something like the customs union for me, the idea that we should be part of a customs union with our biggest trading bloc feels like a no-brainer if your test is jobs, living standards and making life better for people.
Right. I mean, would it bring food prices down, for example, in the way that some Conservatives have said that, I've got an example here, a ball of mozzarella cheese that cost £1.50 now could fall to 91 pence. Well, it's not worth it just for a ball of mozzarella cheese to be a bit cheaper, is it, to come out of the
I think we
union?
should. Look, I actually slightly disagree. I think actually people did actually vote on a wider palette of issues, from migration through to the big political questions about sovereignty and control. And what happened was that the political class dressed up the argument around a slightly cod version of economics. Now, coming down to who could benefit from price changes.
Yeah.
Let's just take us, come with me in my targets that I'm borrowing from the BBC, back to 1971, when Ted Heath was taking us in. In his white paper, he spelt out the fact that food prices would rise by about 2.5% for 5 or 6 years. That was one pledge that Ted Heath kept. The reason for it is that the EU has had high tariffs on food to protect the common agricultural policy. Now, this is the tariff schedule of the EU actually lodged with the World Trade Organization. There's about 12,400 tariffs here. Let's just see. Frozen orange juice, 24.4%. Prepared mackerel, the tariff, 23.3%. Orange juice unfermented,
All right,
23%.
but how much cheaper will it be if we were out of the customs union?
Probably, if we were to go to world trade prices, which is what we had in 1973, you could reduce food prices by between about 6 and 20%.
Would that be worth it, and is that guaranteed?
Well, exactly. It's not guaranteed. So it is a hope. It's a bit of speculation. It's a hope. In the end, it's about the trade-offs. So, yes, you might or you might not get marginally lower food prices, but you will still have a negative knock-on effect on other parts of the economy. And if you go back to the point, you made the point that actually people voted for a range of reasons. That is absolutely right. But there was a chunk of people that voted for the reasons that I've talked about. And no one voted to leave the European Union in order to be worse off. No one, irrespective of what their motivation is. So when you look at the trade-offs against things like the impact on our businesses, the impact on jobs, you have to ask yourself whether it's worth it.
Right, and on that trade-off, how would you argue it then the opposite way? I mean, are you actually saying that we could be guaranteed lower food prices, lower prices on clothing, and we can get things quite cheaply at certain times, can't we, at the moment? Is that going to be a big enough benefit to leaving the customs union and perhaps having to have, trade that's more expensive with the EU?
The future welfare of the UK economy will turn on the kind of policies we do. Now, probably we will disagree on what should be good policy. It will be public spending, it will be taxation, it will be monetary policy, it will be the details of labour market regulation and things like that. That's what will determine whether we are successful in or out of the union. In terms of the prices, if you reduce these tariffs, you can move to a one-off situation. Whatever world prevailing food prices will be, you will have lower prices round here. And I think it's worth emphasising, trade is about exposing your own domestic competition to greater competition and helping the consumer. You hear from the lobbies, you hear from the big businesses who enjoy a protected food industry, protected farming, and you transfer money into the hands of shareholders and people who've got 300 and 400 acres of land worth £10,000 and huge benefits from inheritance tax on that farmland. Now, the shopper in Lidl's and Aldi on a Saturday pays about 6 to 20% more for this stuff than they need to.
All right.
And textiles and cars, it goes all the way through.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Warwick Lightfoot, thank you. And for more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website. You can continue this conversation another time. That's BBC